The following program contains explicit American history. If you suffer from stupidity, Randall may not be right for you. Check with your revisionist historian.
Standing for truth in the four corners of America. Fighting for justice on the frontiers of the culture wars. And turning resistance into an art form. The only TV host arrested more times than Mahatma Gandhi, Randall Terry.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Oh, yeah, baby. I'm a lunatic, but at least I don't howl at the moon. Ow! Oh, I love you. And we're going to have a great show today. Actually, it's going to be a show that molds and directs the thoughts and minds and activities of people, maybe for years to come. Today's top stories: Elena Kagan on the Supreme Court, and pro-life groups looking for a silver lining in a pile of refuse. And we're going to take a trip back in time to Winston Churchill and see, when men were men and women were women, how they dealt with treachery in their midst. Today's program brought to you in part by lifenews.com, telling lies while they pretend to tell the truth, and by America's public school system. You'd have to be trained in a public school to be that stupid to believe that nonsense. I'll be right back with today's program, but first, a word from my good friend, Joey the Hammer.
Maron, I can't believe Elena Kagan is now on the Supreme Court. What's really crazy is that she deceived this court, committed fraud against them, and now she's on the court. She should be in here with me, not up there with those guys. All that notwithstanding, there are other problems facing us, namely the fraud, the lies, the inconceivable nonsense coming from the so-called religious right. They are saying that Elena Kagan has a silver lining. Excuse me, me and my associates know what silver looks like. Nothing that Elena Kagan is bringing to the table looks like silver. It looks a little bit more like you know what I'm talking about.
Welcome, friends, to the largest support group for the victims of government education, Randall Terry, the voice of resistance. Now, I have a big problem today. I'm going to be totally honest with you. The problem is that I have to pace myself internally, the speed at which I talk, because we're going to cover material today that is historical material, and my tendency will be to go a little bit too fast. So, first of all, let me say this. The most important advice that I could give you on certain days would be, when you're done watching this show, to walk away from your television or to walk away from your computer and get a book. A book. They look like this. They have pages in them. Now, this is a Holy Bible. That's an even crazier book, but they look like this. They have pages. They don't have a screen that glares at you. Failing that, go online and do some research about England from 1933 to 1940. If you are a leader, listen to me. I'll say this again during the show. If you're a leader or somebody who wants to be a leader, church leader, political leader, pro-life leader, any kind of leader in a political socio battle, in my opinion, the most important book that you could read, except for the Holy Scriptures, is The Last Lion Alone by William Manchester. Remember that title, The Last Lion Alone by William Manchester. If you're a leader, you have to understand what it means to lead from the wilderness, when everyone is against you, when the things that you're saying are unpopular. Because the model that Churchill gives us, in my opinion, is the most important model, without question, in the last 100 years, but possibly in the last 300 or 400 years. The Last Lion Alone by William Manchester. That's number one. Number two, I would encourage you, go to the computer, as much as I want you to get away, and read the Munich speech delivered by Winston Churchill. If you just Google Munich speech, Winston Churchill, from 1938, it's a masterpiece. And it'll show you the crisis that we're in, why we're in it, and what we need to do to get out. The Munich speech by Winston Churchill, October 5th, 1938. All right, let's go to the news. Everyone knows it. Elena Kagan, confirmed by the U.S. Senate, sworn into the Supreme Court. This is an unmitigated disaster for the pro-life movement, for the Second Amendment, for the right to free speech, for the sacrament of marriage, for the U.S. military. I cannot say enough about what a crisis this is for us. Now, the past is the past. It's over. She's on the court. But what we can do is we can look at what happened to get us here in the hopes of avoiding a debacle like this in the future. So what I'm going to do for the balance of this program is look at England and Winston Churchill and the French and the Nazis in the 1930s, right up until 1940, hopefully to learn some lessons of what we can do to stop the onslaught, the juggernaut, the blitzkrieg of evil that is overwhelming this country. Now, before Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of England, a man named Neville Chamberlain was. And on May 8th, 1940, a British member of Parliament, Leo Amery, gave a devastating speech to Parliament. And he culminated with a quote from Oliver Cromwell. Now, for those of you who don't know who Cromwell was, he called himself the Protector. He had the Protectorate in the 1640s and 50s, okay? He dismissed Parliament, basically became a dictator. And when he marched into the House of Commons with an army, he said to the Parliament, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go!" Those are the words of Oliver Cromwell. Now, Leo Amery is addressing Parliament, and most British members of Parliament did not like Cromwell because he dismissed Parliament. So he took a gamble when he quoted Cromwell, but it worked. And at that moment in 1940, he set the wheels in motion for the downfall of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who had become disgraced as an appeaser of the Nazis. You see, the facts were clear. More than any man in Europe, except for Adolf Hitler himself, Neville Chamberlain, through his policy of appeasement and accommodation, had allowed Adolf Hitler to develop the fiercest war machine in the history of the world, which was overrunning and enslaving millions of people. Now, the words, "In the name of God, go," spoken by Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain, were all the more painful, please hear me, because Amery and Chamberlain were friends. They were colleagues. So it felt doubly painful, but everyone knew that the stakes were so high that England would, in a very short while, be fighting for its very survival against the Nazis, and that it required a painful and unequivocating assessment of the facts. England needed a change of direction. It needed a change of leadership. And the fierce political battle that was unleashed by Leo Amery saying, "In the name of God, go!" it led to what, in my opinion, is the greatest man of the last century becoming the Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill. Literally, within 48 hours of Amery's speech, Chamberlain was no longer the Prime Minister of England. That's how fast things happen over there, folks. Churchill was. And it happened because a man had the courage and the integrity to tell the truth about a leader who was supposedly standing against Hitler, but in reality whose policies and rhetoric and actions and inactions had aided Hitler. Now, my purpose in this statement and during this show is to ultimately defeat the child killers, okay? But if we're going to defeat them, we have to show who are the appeasers of the murderers. Whose policies, strategies, rhetoric, actions, images have led to this moment of defeat and subjugation before Elena Kagan. And I want to say it again. There is no silver lining to this unless you want to paw through refuse and come up with lead. There's no silver lining. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to look at the fall of France to Hitler. We're going to compare it to the prostration of the pro-life movement to Kagan. And by the way, for those of you who are not necessarily pro-life activists, your thing is marriage, Second Amendment, ending of taxation, immigration crisis, whatever it is. You have something to learn here. So don't turn the dial if you go, I don't want to hear Randall talk about pro-life. Be smart enough to learn the lessons that we're discussing, and you will be benefited by Winston Churchill, one of the greatest men who ever lived. I'll be right back.
Randall and I made a trip to Mars as part of a secret project. Okay, I lied. It was actually to the moon with Neil Armstrong.
Moments with Moses. You shall not see your brother's donkey, or his ox fallen down by the way, and withhold your help from them. You shall help him to lift them up again.
Welcome back to the program, friend. Did you know that on the very day that Churchill became prime minister, the Germans unleashed their blitzkrieg against Belgium and Luxembourg and Holland and France? And in a little less than a month, France fell. But before France fell, the British Expeditionary Forces and some French forces, over 300,000 soldiers, were pinned down at Dunkirk, and it looked like there was going to be an annihilation of the British Army. The miracle of Dunkirk happened, and British military vessels and a lot of private vessels, hundreds of them, ferried men across the English Channel while British airplanes circled overhead shooting at German airplanes who were trying to strafe and to bomb the ships that were taking these men to freedom. Now, the English airplanes were able to fend off the attack, which was awesome. When it was all said and done, Churchill briefed Parliament on the success of the evacuation. But he had the presence of mind to say, please hear me. Churchill said, quote, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." That's what he said. Now he went on to say, and I quote, "What has happened in France and Belgium is a colossal military disaster." He did not lie to them, as Chamberlain had repeatedly done. He didn't tell them, we're winning, like some pro-lifers are doing in the battle to end child killing. They keep saying we're winning when we're losing. All right, on June 22nd, 1940, the French Marshal Pétain agreed to Hitler's terms of surrender. It was a cataclysmic defeat. It was a crisis for England. It was an ominous threat to the entire free world. Now, Churchill, again addressing the House of Commons, said of the French, and I quote, "They have delivered themselves over to the power of the enemy and lie wholly in his power." They've delivered themselves over to the enemy and lie wholly in his power. Note the dark yet honest clarity of Churchill's words. His mind was not fogged in self-delusion as Chamberlain's had been. He was not interested in appeasing the enemy or deceiving his fellow countrymen by painting a rosy picture for them. We have got to tell the truth. Those of us that are in leadership positions, we have to tell people we're losing. We have to be honest. As the record shows, I have been discussing certain pro-life groups and pro-life leaders and pro-life talkers who use words and deeds, and more often fail to use certain words and deeds, that have resulted in the slow, steady defeat of the pro-life cause and the brutal murder of unborn babies by the millions. By the way, the same defeat is happening in the pro-marriage movement. In the battle to keep Elena Kagan off of the Supreme Court, we have seen with chilling transparency that most pro-life groups and leaders did little or nothing to stop her. Chilling transparency. They raised money, they whined, they talked, but they did little or nothing to stop her. And now they're sending out press releases condemning that she's on the court, but they didn't do anything. We have to be honest. Elena Kagan, the child killers, Obama, they were victorious in this battle. We lost. The babies lost. And to make matters worse, false analysts are declaring at this very moment of shame and defeat that we're winning. All right, when we come back from this break, I've got to read to you a clip from a news source of the pro-life movement, lifenews.com. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I'll read it to you when we come back from this break. Don't go away.
Randall Terry.
An appeaser is one who feeds the crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. Sir Winston Churchill. Welcome back to the program, friend. The other night after Kagan's victory, I was in front of my computer doing news research, and I stumbled on a site, lifenews.com, run by a young man named Stephen Urtelt, who sells himself as a pro-life news source. He's basically a blogger. He's not a trained journalist. He has repeatedly shown a grave lack of journalistic integrity at his site, and many of us have held him accountable on that. And I can tell you that a lot of secular journalists have more integrity than that site does, and they're the ones that are supposedly all against us, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I couldn't believe what I was reading. The story was entitled, Opponents of Pro-Abortion Elena Kagan's Supreme Court Bid Find Silver Lining. It went on to do a news story on an op-ed piece. I'm not kidding. A news story on an op-ed piece written by a guy named Carl Levy, printed in the Daily Caller. And this op-ed piece and Mr. Urtelt's coverage of it tried to make this colossal defeat for the babies seem like a string of victories. It was disgusting. It was appalling. Now here's a sample of this partisan cheerleading. Quote, Republican senators mounted their strongest opposition in more than a century, sending strong signals to the White House about the future Supreme Court picks while teeing up important issues for this fall's Senate races. Conservative groups and Senate Republicans, particularly GOP leader Mitch McConnell and Judiciary Ranking Member Jeff Sessions, worked hard to get out the disturbing truth about Elena Kagan. End of quote. This is one long string of lies. I repeat, these are lies designed to get you and I to fall in line and get behind the Neville Chamberlains of today, Republican hacks and failed pro-life groups. How dare any of us, whether Steve Urtelt, Carl Levy, or any clergymen, anyone, say or even imply that we are winning in the presence of 50 million mangled babies. How dare we say we're winning when we just lost, without almost a fight, by the way, to Elena Kagan? This is the same delusional, destructive spirit that embodied Neville Chamberlain, which almost cost England their survival. We don't need bouncing cheerleaders to swing pom-poms around and tell us, we're winning. All right? While we're down by an insurmountable score. This is not high school basketball. You hearing me, Steve? This is a life and death struggle with real victims, and we are losing. All right, when we come back from this break, I've got to tell you the last bit of news, and that was how Winston Churchill, please hear me, ordered the sinking of the French fleet. This will all make sense. I'll be right back. Be not silent, O God of my praise, for wicked and deceitful mouths are opened against me, speaking against me with lying tongues. Back to the program. A lot of people are saying, oh, Randall, we don't want to see infighting with the pro-life movement. Look at what Churchill did to the French Navy. Sometimes infighting is required if you're going to have victory against the real enemy. And in this case, it's the baby killers. When the French surrendered to the Germans, England said, go ahead, surrender if you need to, but turn the fleet over to us. Do not give the French Navy to the Germans. Guess what the French did? They agreed to surrender. They gave 400 German pilots back to the Germans, and they said to the Germans, you can have our fleet. That could have cost England its survival. Okay? So in his speech on July 4th, 1942, Churchill said, it is our inflexible resolve to do everything that is possible in order to prevent these ships from falling into the German grip. I leave the judgment of our action with confidence to Parliament, to the nation, to the United States, to the world, to history. And Churchill was clear with the French and with Parliament that the ships would not be allowed to go to the Germans, and if necessary, he would sink them. He offered the French, hey, fight with us. They wouldn't. And so Churchill ordered them destroyed. In one battle, the French now, or rather the English fighting the French, over 1,200 French sailors died. But it was because the British had to defeat the Germans. Sometimes we're going to have a fight when we have people in our midst that are collaborators with the baby killers. Think about it. See you tomorrow.